How many times in our life has Jesus done the impossible, and then in the next chapter of our lives, we don't think that he can do it again? How many times in our lives has he been faithful in one chapter of our life? He's done a miracle in one chapter in our life. He's done the impossible in one season, in one moment, in one year, or one event, and then the next day, we find ourselves in a similar place, and we don't think that he's going to do it. In one chapter, he was faithful, and then less than 2 chapters, the disciples were already forgetful. But not even chapter by chapter. If you look at it, it's literally verse by verse. Right? In 1 through 10, Jesus feeds 4,000 people. And then here we see in this section right here, verse 7, or in verse 17, they already forgot that he fed all of those people again. And here they have 1 loaf between 12, and they still don't think he's going to care for them. How many times, not even chapter by chapter, how many times is it verse by verse in our lives that we forget his faithfulness to us? I mean, you don't have to think, oh, he did it then, and now he could do it again. Sometimes it's church was great on Sunday, and then Monday, all hell breaks loose, and you lose your faith. It doesn't even have to be chapter by chapter. Sometimes it's day by day. Sometimes it's week by week. Sometimes it's moment by moment, minute by minute. We are forgetful when he is faithful. He says, do you not yet remember? Do you remember my faithfulness to you? Sometimes I got to remind myself of God's faithfulness. I got to say, okay, Byron, just think. When I find myself in a situation or in a moment where I feel like it's impossible and my back's up against the wall and I need a miracle, I have to remind myself of his faithfulness. I have to say, okay, Byron, just think. Do you remember when you and Ashley first got married? And you were so broke, you couldn't pay rent. And you had to make a decision. Do you pay rent or do you buy groceries? You paid your rent, you showed up, and there were groceries on our doorstep. Faithful. Do you remember again, because you were in college, and you were married, and you were 22, and you were broke, and you again couldn't pay your rent, and you decided that you were going to tithe anyway. And then in the church lobby, someone walked up and gave you a Pentecostal handshake with just enough money to pay your rent. Faithful. Byron, you shouldn't even be pastoring this church. You should be dead in a ditch somewhere. And look what God has done in your life. Faithful. Do you remember whenever you were so depressed and angry and bitter at God, you drove up to the church because that's where you thought that he lived? And you were sitting in your papa's truck, cursing him out. And on that day, instead of killing yourself, you got filled with the Holy Spirit, and your life has never been the same again. He was faithful. Do you remember when the gig kicked you out and you said, hey, it's okay, because we just signed a lease on the new building the same week? Faithful. Do you remember when you didn't have enough money to launch this church, and then one pastor from Houston called and said, I believe in you, cut you a check for $30,000? Faithful. Come on, Byron, think. Byron, do you remember when you were talking to your CMN church planting coach walking up and down Broadway and you wanted to quit planting the church because nobody was joining your team and you didn't have a worship leader, and then the next week you realized that Bo Michael King lived on Broadway and you were complaining right in front of his house? Faithful. Come on, Byron, think. Do you remember when Steak and Shake bought the old Parkdale Assembly and then they gave you the $50,000 to build out this building? You thought it couldn't happen. He made it happen. Faithful. Come on, Byron, think. Remind yourself of his faithfulness. Over and over, he has proven himself faithful. But the reason we miss our miracle is because we are forgetful. Remind yourself of his faithfulness. He sits down with his disciples and says, guys, do you get this? Do you yet understand? Over and over and over and over and over again, I have proven myself faithful. Chapter 1, faithful. Chapter 2, what was he? Faithful. Chapter 3, what was he? Faithful. Chapter 4, faithful. Chapter 5, faithful. Chapter 6, faithful. Chapter 7, faithful. Chapter 8, faithful. And if you don't come back next week, I'll tell you what happens. He's faithful. Chapter 9, he's going to be faithful. Chapter 10, he's going to be faithful. In one chapter of your life, faithful. In the next chapter of your life, faithful. He will be faithful. He's faithful. You need to remind yourself of his faithfulness. He has never failed you. He has never given up on you. He has never walked out on you. He has never forsaken you. Yeah, the miracle may not be what you expected, but he has been faithful.